Everyone laughed when a single dad bought an abandoned hospital for just $4,500. The whole town thought he'd lost his mind, until his little girl opened a door that had been sealed for 40 years and uncovered a secret worth $180 million. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The last time Dr. Daniel Reyes held a scalpel, his hands were steady, but his heart was breaking. It was a routine cardiac procedure, one he had performed hundreds of times before. The sterile lights of the operating room glared down like interrogators, reflecting off the instruments that once felt like extensions of his own fingers. But that morning, he was not only a surgeon, he was a husband watching the woman he loved slipping away beneath his own hands. Eleanor's face, usually calm even in chaos, was hidden behind the oxygen mask, her chest rising and falling unevenly. She had trusted him, as she always did. The irony was unbearable. The man who had repaired hundreds of hearts could do nothing for hers. A burst aneurysm, a few seconds of chaos, and a silence that swallowed the room whole. The monitor flatlined. No matter how many times he shouted her name, she did not answer. After that day, something inside Daniel broke in a way no medicine could mend. The hospital corridors that once pulsed with life became haunted halls of memory. His colleagues tried to console him, but their words bounced off his grief like stones against glass. The first tremor in his hand came a week later while pouring coffee. A small thing, almost invisible. But soon it grew worse. The tremor followed him everywhere, into the kitchen, into sleep, into the moments when he reached out to touch his daughter's face and had to stop, terrified of his own hands. Their apartment in Philadelphia turned into a mausoleum of the life they had before. The smell of Eleanor's lavender shampoo still lingered in the bathroom. Her medical textbooks, filled with handwritten notes, sat on the shelf untouched. There were photographs of her laughing at the lake, holding Lily on her shoulders, sunlight in her hair. Daniel couldn't bear to take them down, yet couldn't bear to look at them either. Nights were the worst. The silence pressed against his chest like a weight. Sometimes he woke up reaching for her, only to grasp empty sheets and the echo of her name. Lily was 9, too young to understand death in full, but old enough to sense the gravity that had swallowed her father. She stopped asking where her mother had gone. Instead, she began to draw. Her pictures filled the apartment. Bright skies, stick figures holding hands, smiling suns. On one, she wrote in crooked letters, "When Mom was here, it was brighter." Daniel found it taped to the fridge one morning. He stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening. That evening, when Lily showed him another drawing of a hospital with a giant heart over it, he excused himself to the bathroom and locked the door. He turned on the faucet to hide the sound of his sobs. The hospital board tried to be patient. Daniel had been one of their best trauma surgeons, but as weeks turned to months, the tremor in his hand became impossible to ignore. Patients noticed. Nurses hesitated. Rumors began. Finally, the chief of staff called him in. The words were clinical, devoid of cruelty, yet merciless all the same. "We believe you need time, indefinite leave." He signed the papers without protest. As he left the building, the automatic doors slid shut behind him, with a hiss that sounded like a verdict. Bills began to pile up. Insurance barely covered Eleanor's treatment, and the savings vanished faster than he expected. They sold the car, then the furniture, until all that was left was a small 2-room apartment above a laundromat that smelled of detergent and loneliness. Daniel spent his days sitting by the window, staring at the traffic below. Sometimes his hands lay still on the table. Other times they twitched, betraying the storm inside him. The city outside moved on without him. Sirens, laughter, the hum of life that no longer included his own. Lily tried to keep him afloat in her own quiet way. She brought him tea, told him stories from school, made him promise to smile once a day. But the man she remembered, her father, the healer, the unshakable Dr. Reyes, was gone. In his place sat a stranger with hollow eyes and hands that couldn't stop shaking. Then one gray afternoon, the phone rang. Daniel almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and he had long stopped expecting good news. On the other end was an old colleague, Dr. Harris, who still worked at the hospital. His tone was cautious, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Danny," he said, "I heard what happened. I'm sorry, but I might have something that could help you start over." Daniel almost hung up, but the word "start over" snagged on his heart. Dr. Harris explained that a small county upstate was trying to get rid of an old property, Willow Hill Medical Center, a hospital that had been abandoned decades ago. The county wanted it off their books. "You could buy it for next to nothing," Harris said. "Just don't expect much. It's old, needs work, but maybe it's something to keep you busy." It sounded absurd, like a cruel joke. But Daniel couldn't shake the idea. A place far from the city, far from reminders of what he had lost. Maybe he could fix it, the way he used to fix people. That night, after Lily went to sleep, he pulled out Eleanor's old laptop and began looking at pictures. The few he found were grainy, taken years ago, but he imagined the halls filled with light again. He imagined working not as a surgeon, maybe, but as a man with purpose. He called Dr. Harris back the next morning. "I'll take it," he said. The deal moved fast. Too fast, perhaps. A few signatures, a wire transfer, and the property was his. He sold the last of their belongings, packed what little they owned into the back of a rusted SUV, and told Lily they were going on an adventure. She clapped her hands, not knowing that adventure was another word for desperation. The morning they left Philadelphia, the sky was the color of steel. Daniel drove in silence, the city shrinking behind them. Lily sang softly in the back seat, watching the trees blur into green and gold. After hours on the highway, the GPS led them off the main road and onto a winding path through the hills. Mist rolled across the fields. The air smelled of pine and rain. When they reached the crest of the final hill, Daniel saw it, Willow Hill Medical Center. The building loomed in the distance, its silhouette fractured against the sky. Windows were missing, ivy climbed up the walls like veins, and the once white facade had turned the color of bone. For a moment, he thought of turning back. But then Lily leaned forward, pressing her face against the glass. "Is that it, Dad? Our new home?" He wanted to say no. He wanted to say they'd made a mistake. But instead, he nodded. "That's it, sweetheart." As they drove closer, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint rattle of a loose metal sign. The words Willow Hill Medical Center swayed in the breeze, half obscured by moss. The parking lot was cracked and littered with weeds, a graveyard of rusted wheelchairs and forgotten stretchers. Daniel parked the car and stepped out. The ground was soft from last night's rain. Lily jumped into a puddle, laughing, her reflection rippling with each splash. He stared at the building and felt a mix of awe and dread. This was no hospital, it was a ruin, a monument to neglect. Yet beneath the decay, something stubborn still stood. The bones of a place that once healed. He glanced at his trembling hands. They seemed steadier now, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose. He took Lily's hand and started toward the entrance. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's see what we bought." Inside, the air was thick with dust and age. The grand lobby stretched before them, its marble floors cracked, but still faintly gleaming beneath layers of grime. A chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull but intact. Faded posters lined the walls, reminders of a time when hope lived here. Your health, our mission. Lily's footsteps echoed as she explored. "It's big," she whispered. "Really big." Daniel nodded. "It used to save lives." "Maybe it can again," she said. He looked at her, her small hand gripping his, her eyes full of unshaken belief, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Not joy, not even hope, but the faint, fragile outline of purpose. That night, as the sun sank behind the hills, Daniel sat on the steps of the hospital and watched the last light fade from the broken windows. The air was cold, and the wind carried the smell of earth and rust. He thought of Eleanor, how she used to talk about light, how every patient deserved a chance to see it again. He whispered into the darkness, "Maybe we'll find it here." Lily came to sit beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Mom would like it here," she murmured. "It's quiet, peaceful." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "she would." Above them, the first stars appeared through the torn clouds. The building behind them groaned as if exhaling after years of silence. Somewhere deep inside its walls, a forgotten light flickered to life, a dying bulb catching a current. Daniel noticed it through the window, a tiny glow in the endless dark. He took it as a sign. The next morning they would begin cleaning. He would find tools, repair what he could. It didn't matter if people laughed or called him crazy. He had nothing left but a promise to his daughter, to Eleanor, and to the part of himself that refused to die. As the wind whispered through the empty corridors of Willow Hill, Daniel closed his eyes and made that promise aloud. "We'll make it shine again." And though the world around him had long since forgotten his name, the hill seemed to listen. Somewhere in the quiet, the hospital breathed. By the time dawn rose over the hills, the mist around Willow Hill had begun to thin, revealing the hospital in its full, raw decay. The pale morning light spilled across the cracked facade and vines that clung to every surface like veins on an aging hand. Daniel stood on the front steps with a thermos of coffee gone cold, staring at the building as if it were a patient in need of resuscitation. The silence was so heavy that even the sound of a distant crow made him flinch. It wasn't a place that whispered of healing anymore. It was a place that had forgotten what life sounded like. Behind him, Lily came out wrapped in a blanket, her hair tangled from sleep. She blinked at the world slowly awakening around them. "It looks different in the light," she said softly, still half dreaming. Daniel followed her gaze. In daylight, the damage was more brutal, more humiliatingly clear. Whole sections of the roof had caved in. The outer walls bore scars from rain and time. What he had once imagined as a faded building with potential now stood as a monument to foolish hope. The structure groaned as the morning breeze swept through the open windows. Still, something about it, its stubborn endurance, its refusal to collapse entirely, mirrored something deep within him. They walked around the perimeter together. The front lawn, or what used to be one, had transformed into a wild patch of thorns and tall grass. A rusted ambulance was half buried near the side entrance, its once white body now streaked with orange and brown. In the back courtyard, Daniel found the remnants of an old swing set, just 2 poles and a dangling chain, swaying faintly in the wind. The air smelled of mold and wet leaves. When they returned to the front, a pickup truck had pulled up to the roadside. 2 men leaned against it, watching. One spat into the dirt, the other gave a slow grin. "You the doc from Philly?" he called out. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Yes." The man laughed and nudged his friend. "Well, Doc, you just bought yourself a graveyard. Didn't they tell you this place is cursed?" Lily moved closer to her father. The word cursed seemed to echo around the empty lot. Daniel forced a smile. "I don't believe in curses," he said. "Sure you don't," the man replied, chuckling. "None of the others did either, but every fool who tried to fix this dump left before winter. Some say the walls talk, others say they breathe." He climbed back into his truck. "Anyway, welcome to town, Doc. You'll make good gossip for the week." The truck roared away, leaving behind a trail of laughter and exhaust. Daniel watched them disappear, jaw tight. He'd been a subject of pity before. Mockery was new. The humiliation burned deeper than he expected. Lily tugged at his sleeve. "They don't know what they're talking about," she said, her small voice firm. He looked at her and felt something ease in his chest. "No," he agreed. "They don't." They spent the rest of the morning exploring inside. The front doors, though warped, opened after a few hard pulls. The smell inside was almost physical dust, damp wood, faint traces of rot. Their footsteps echoed in the cavernous lobby. A broken gurney lay tipped over near the reception desk. Old paperwork littered the floor, some sheets so brittle they disintegrated at a touch. The air was still, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. In one of the main corridors, faded murals of smiling doctors and nurses looked down on them with ghostly cheer. A single fluorescent bulb near the ceiling flickered weakly, though there was no electricity running through the building. Daniel frowned, trying to explain it logically, but Lily only smiled and whispered, "Maybe the hospital's happy we're here." He almost laughed, but something about her words made his throat tighten. They found a small office at the back of the lobby that was relatively dry. A cracked window let in a beam of soft light, and an old filing cabinet could still be used as a table. Daniel decided this would be their temporary living space. He brought in their sleeping bags, a camp stove, a few groceries, and his toolbox. By evening, the faint smell of soup filled the room, mixing oddly with the scent of decay outside. Lily explored while he worked. Every few minutes, she'd call out from another hallway, her voice bouncing through the emptiness. "Dad, I found a room with pictures." Or, "There's a piano here. It only has 3 keys that still work." Her laughter filled the corridors like birdsong, and for brief moments, the place didn't seem so lifeless. After dinner, they sat together near the window, watching the light fade. The town below was small, just a scattering of rooftops and one main street with a diner, a post office, and a gas station. The church bell rang at 7, a low, mournful tone that drifted up the hill. Daniel wondered if anyone down there was still talking about the crazy doctor. He didn't have to wonder long. The next morning, as he drove into town for supplies, conversation stopped the moment he entered the hardware store. 2 older men by the counter exchanged glances. The clerk, a woman with a kind but wary face, forced a smile. "You must be the one who bought Willow Hill," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied simply. "Well," she said after a pause, scanning his list of cleaning supplies and tools, "I hope you've got patience. That place is older than most of us here. Used to be a good hospital once upon a time. Then came the fire back in '83. Folks say the spirits of the patients never left." "I don't believe in spirits either," he said quietly. She gave him a look halfway between pity and caution. "You will if you stay long enough." By the time he returned to the hill, clouds had gathered over the town, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Lily was sitting on the steps, waiting for him, her hair whipping in the wind. She had drawn something in chalk on the stone, a large sun shining over the outline of the hospital. Beneath it, she had written in careful, uneven letters, "Home." He knelt beside her, staring at the word until it blurred before his eyes. "Home, huh?" She nodded. "You said we'd fix it. I believe you." He looked up at the hospital again. From this angle, its silhouette seemed softer, less menacing. "Then I guess we better start," he said. Days passed in a slow rhythm. Mornings began with the sound of crows and ended with the quiet hum of crickets. Daniel scrubbed walls, cleared debris, and fixed leaks. Lily followed him, singing, her small hands smudged with dirt and paint. They discovered rooms filled with relics from the past, old patient charts, faded photographs of staff picnics, even a pair of dusty leather shoes left under a bed. Each find made the hospital feel less like a ruin and more like a story paused mid-sentence. But the nights were harder. The wind whistled through the corridors, carrying faint echoes. Sometimes Daniel could swear he heard footsteps on the floor above them. Once, while fixing a broken pipe in the basement, he found a wooden sign that read, "Private, no entry." It was nailed to a locked metal door. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine, though he told himself it was just the cold. One evening, he caught sight of Lily standing before that same door. Her flashlight beam danced across its surface. "Why is it locked, Dad?" she asked. "It's probably unsafe," he said, taking her by the hand. "Basement walls can collapse." She looked at him with an expression far too knowing for her age. "Or maybe it's hiding something good." He smiled despite himself. "You've been watching too many adventure movies." But later that night, when he lay awake listening to the building breathe, her words returned to him. Maybe it's hiding something good. A week later, the rain came, hard and endless, beating against the cracked windows and leaking through the roof. Daniel and Lily moved their sleeping bags closer to the wall where the ceiling didn't drip. They played cards by flashlight until the battery died, then sat in the dark listening to the storm. It was during one of those long silences that Lily spoke. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" she asked. Daniel's throat tightened. He could barely see her face, but he could feel her eyes on him. "I think," he said slowly, "she'd be proud that we didn't give up." The rain drummed louder, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like a heartbeat. When morning came, the air was clearer, washed clean. The clouds parted to reveal a soft blue sky, and for the first time since they'd arrived, sunlight poured through the broken windows, scattering gold across the dusty floor. That morning, Daniel decided to start working on the east wing. It had the least damage, and he hoped to make it their proper living space. As he pried open a warped door, he noticed something peculiar. The elevator shaft beside it went higher than the building's visible floors. He frowned. There were 5 floors, yet the old control panel had a 6th button, painted over but still faintly visible beneath the layers. He stood there for a long moment, staring. He thought about the locked door in the basement, about the word private, about how every place had secrets buried under dust and silence. But he said nothing to Lily. Not yet. That night, as he sat by the window with a notebook and flashlight, he began sketching a plan of the hospital, mapping what he'd explored. There were inconsistencies, hallways that didn't match, spaces that seemed larger inside than out. Something about the building's design didn't add up. He thought again of the mocking laughter of the townspeople, of the stories about voices in the walls. He wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, but as the wind swept through the halls, it carried a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. He turned off the light and listened. The sound faded, leaving only silence. Lily stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly. He brushed her hair from her face and whispered, "Everything's fine." But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of corridors stretching endlessly, of a locked door that opened by itself, and of Eleanor standing inside, her eyes filled with light. She didn't speak. She only pointed toward the darkness beyond her and smiled. Daniel woke before dawn, heart pounding. The rain had started again, tapping gently on the windows. He sat up and looked around the dimly lit room, at the cracked ceiling, the shadowed corners, the faint glimmer of Lily's drawings on the wall. Tomorrow, he thought, he would check that basement again. He didn't know what he was looking for, or why he suddenly felt that the building was trying to show him something. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He hadn't come to Willow Hill by accident. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the ivy that covered the walls. Somewhere deep in the hospital's heart, a faint metallic sound echoed like a chain, shifting after decades of stillness. Daniel sat motionless, listening, and felt the first spark of curiosity push through the cracks of his exhaustion. Perhaps the town was right. Perhaps this place was cursed. Or perhaps, like him, it was just waiting to be healed. The storm passed during the night, leaving the hills soaked and shining under the pale morning light. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, clean and raw, as though the world had been rinsed of its noise. Daniel stood in the doorway of the hospital, mug of coffee warming his hands, and stared out over the valley. Wisps of mist clung to the treetops, and for a moment everything felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed down to listen. The hospital behind him was quiet, too quiet. Only the drip of water from a broken gutter broke the stillness. It was hard to believe that just months ago he had been a man of precision, a surgeon whose life revolved around seconds and heartbeat rhythms. Now his world was defined by creaking beams, peeling paint, and the low hum of loneliness. Yet the longer he stood there, the more the building seemed less like a ruin and more like a wounded thing. He could almost sense its pulse again, faint but present. Lily was still asleep on her cot, the blankets tangled around her. She had fallen asleep the night before while drawing, a set of colored pencils scattered across the floor. When Daniel bent to gather them, he found her latest picture, a bright version of the hospital with flowers climbing its walls, sunlight streaming through every window. Above the door she had written, in her uneven hand, "The place that heals." He stared at the words for a long time, feeling a heaviness in his chest that was not pain, but something close to gratitude. Maybe she was right. Maybe this broken place could heal both of them in ways he couldn't yet understand. The morning passed in quiet work. He swept debris from the main hall, patched a leak in the roof, and carried out old, rusted equipment that smelled of disinfectant and dust. Every sound echoed like a whisper of the past. At noon, Lily woke and joined him, her small frame moving among the towering corridors with fearless energy. "We should open the windows," she said, dragging a chair to reach one of them. "Let the ghosts out." Daniel smiled despite himself. "You think there are ghosts?" "Only the sad kind," she said seriously. "The kind that want to go home." He didn't answer. Instead, he helped her pry open the rusted latch, and the room filled with fresh air and sunlight. The light cut through the gloom, scattering across the marble floor, and for the first time since they had arrived, the space felt alive. Dust particles shimmered like tiny stars suspended in motion. He thought again of Eleanor, how she used to open all the windows in their apartment on Sunday mornings, no matter the weather, saying that light was the best kind of medicine. That afternoon, while exploring the East Wing, they discovered an old storage closet filled with yellowing papers and water-damaged medical files. Most were unreadable, but one folder caught Daniel's attention. It was marked Willow Hill Research Unit, 1956. He opened it carefully. Inside were typed pages detailing experimental treatments for cardiac recovery, signed by someone named Dr. Matthew Holt. The name stirred something in Daniel's memory. He had read about Holt years ago during residency, a brilliant but controversial surgeon who disappeared suddenly in the late 1950s, his work lost to rumor and speculation. According to legend, Holt had been on the verge of developing the first artificial cardiac regulator, a primitive version of the modern pacemaker. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he traced the faded ink. "Lily," he called softly, "I think this hospital used to be more than just a community place. There was research here, big research." She peered over his shoulder, wide-eyed. "Like secret experiments?" "Not bad ones," he said, smiling. "The kind that help people live longer." She grinned. "Maybe that's what it's hiding." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The wind outside was calm, yet the hospital seemed to creak as though shifting in its sleep. He sat by the window with a flashlight, reading through Holt's notes. Some sections were technical, written in the shorthand only surgeons used. Others read almost like confessions lines about pressure from sponsors, ethical dilemmas, and a sense that his discoveries were being watched by the wrong people. In one entry, Holt mentioned a secure lab space in the lower wing, accessible only through the basement. Daniel frowned. The basement, that same word, private, he had seen nailed over the locked door. He felt his pulse quicken. The next morning, while Lily drew outside on the steps, he went down to the basement alone. The air grew colder as he descended, and the smell of rust and mildew thickened. The narrow staircase ended in darkness, and for a moment he considered turning back. But then his flashlight caught the glint of metal ahead. The same locked door stood waiting, the word private stenciled across it in faded red paint. He ran his hand over the metal. It was thick, reinforced, the kind used for containment rather than privacy. Someone had wanted to keep this place sealed for good. Still, the curiosity gnawed at him. He fetched his tools from upstairs, an old crowbar, a hammer, a set of wrenches, and returned. The first strike rang out like thunder in the confined space. The sound echoed up the stairs, followed by a scattering of dust. The hinges resisted, but time was weaker than persistence. It took nearly an hour before the final bolt gave way with a scream of metal. The door opened an inch, releasing a gust of stale, cold air. He pushed it wider and stepped inside. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a room frozen in another century. Everything was eerily preserved. Work tables covered with glass instruments, metal drawers labeled with technical terms, and a row of cabinets against the far wall. Papers lay stacked neatly on a desk, untouched by decay. The air was dry, unnaturally so. It was as if the room had been sealed in its own bubble of time. He walked slowly, his footsteps muffled on the concrete floor. The more he looked, the more he realized this wasn't just a laboratory, it was a vault. The instruments were unlike anything he'd seen outside of museums. Crude prototypes of surgical tools, early monitoring devices, and what looked like the partial casing of a pacemaker prototype. Each was tagged with Holt's initials. On the far wall hung a black and white photograph of a man in a lab coat, standing proudly beside a team of nurses and engineers. Beneath it, the caption read, "Dr. Matthew Holt, Willow Hill Research Division, 1956. Daniel felt lightheaded. This was it, the missing work, the mystery that had disappeared from medical history. He found a metal box beneath the desk and opened it. Inside were several small notebooks, written in Holt's precise handwriting. In the first one, dated August 1956, Holt wrote, "If they shut us down, I'll hide the prototypes here. The world will not understand yet, but one day someone will." Daniel sat down slowly, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. For the first time in years, he felt something more powerful than grief purpose. He heard footsteps then, light and quick, and turned sharply. Lily stood in the doorway, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. I followed you, she said breathlessly. You were gone too long. He tried to scold her, but her wonder silenced him. What is this place, Dad? He exhaled. A part of history. He knelt beside her and held up one of the notebooks. This man worked here almost 70 years ago. He was trying to build something that could save lives, and when the world turned its back, he hid it all away. Lily's eyes widened. Like a treasure? He nodded slowly. Exactly like that. They explored together for hours, moving from table to table, examining each artifact. The old machinery glinted under their flashlights, beautiful in its own industrial way. It wasn't gold or jewels, but it was worth more to Daniel than anything else. Each instrument represented innovation, risk, and the relentless drive to heal, the same drive that once defined his own life. By the time they returned upstairs, night had fallen. The air above felt lighter somehow, as if the building itself had exhaled a long-held secret. Daniel sat by the window again, but this time not in despair. He opened Holt's notebook to a random page and read aloud to Lily, who listened with her chin resting on her knees. The entry described the invention as a mechanical heartbeat for when the body forgets its rhythm. That's beautiful, she whispered. Yes, he said. It is. For the next several days, Daniel contacted experts. He reached out to a university historian in a medical museum in Boston, sending photos and scanned documents. Their responses came swiftly, filled with disbelief and excitement. One curator wrote, "If authenticated, this could be the most significant medical discovery of the century." Dr. Holt's work was thought to be completely lost. They arranged to send a team for verification. Meanwhile, word spread through the small town. The same people who had laughed now watched from afar with curiosity. Daniel noticed more cars slowing at the base of the hill, drivers peering up toward the hospital as if expecting to see light pouring from its windows. A journalist even appeared one morning, snapping photos and shouting questions. Daniel didn't answer any. The truth felt too sacred to cheapen with sound bites. Lily, however, took everything in stride. She made a sign and hung it above the door. Work in progress, healing in process. She spent her afternoons drawing in the newly cleaned corridors, leaving pictures taped to the walls. Bright suns, blue hearts, families holding hands. The hospital, once a hollow shell, now echoed with laughter and footsteps. One evening, as they ate dinner by lantern light, Lily looked at her father and said, "You don't shake anymore." He glanced at his hands. It was true. They were steady. "I guess I don't," he said softly. She smiled. "Maybe the hospital's healing you too." He wanted to deny it, to remind her that people heal themselves, not buildings. But he couldn't, not after what he'd seen, what he'd felt in the last few days. Somehow this place, the place everyone called cursed, had begun to breathe again, and with it, so had he. When the verification team arrived 2 weeks later, they treated the discovery with reverence. They photographed every piece, carefully cataloged every document. The lead historian, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, turned to Daniel after hours of inspection. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked. "You've restored a piece of history. Holt's prototypes laid the groundwork for modern cardiac medicine. The collection you found is priceless." Daniel looked around the lab. The instruments, the dust, the decades of silence now filled with voices once more. "It wasn't me," he said quietly. "It was waiting for someone to listen." That night, after the experts left and the building fell silent again, Daniel stood outside under the stars. The hill glowed faintly in the moonlight, the restored windows reflecting silver. Lily came out beside him, wrapped in a blanket. "So what happens now?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "Now we make it right," he said. "Right?" He turned to her, smiling faintly. "This place gave us back something we lost. Maybe it's time we give something back." Lily nodded solemnly, as if understanding far more than her age should allow. Together they looked up at the towering silhouette of the hospital. Somewhere inside, the old generator hummed softly, alive again after decades of silence. The building that had once been called cursed now stood poised for rebirth. Daniel knew then that his life had shifted course forever. What began as desperation had become purpose. The storm had passed, the ghosts had been heard, and beneath the dust and ruin of Willow Hill, He had found more than forgotten inventions. He had found his heartbeat again. The morning after the historians left, the hill was wrapped in a hush that felt almost sacred. Daniel woke early, his body still aching from the long days of work, yet his mind clearer than it had been in years. The hospital was different now. Even its silence seemed alive. The rooms that once felt like tombs now carried faint traces of movement and purpose. Light streamed through the windows of the east wing, illuminating dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. Lily was still asleep in her cot, one hand resting on her sketchbook. Daniel stood for a long moment watching her breathe. There was something in that sight, the simple rhythm of his daughter's chest rising and falling, that reminded him why he had come here, not to escape his past, but to build a future she could believe in. By mid-morning, the town had begun to stir with curiosity. Cars slowed as they passed the base of Willow Hill, their drivers staring up at the newly cleaned facade. Word of the discovery had spread beyond the county, a story that newspapers could not resist. Disgraced surgeon unearths lost medical treasure, one headline read. Forgotten hospital, forgotten genius, and the man who found them. Daniel tried not to read them, but every store clerk, every stranger in town seemed to know his name now. It was unsettling. For years he had lived in obscurity, invisible to the world. Now his quiet project had become a beacon. The first call came from Boston University's Department of Medical History. They wanted to display Dr. Holt's instruments in an exhibition. Another came from a foundation in Washington offering a research grant if Daniel agreed to restore the site as a memorial laboratory. But the call that changed everything arrived late one evening, when the sky outside was painted in the colors of fading fire. The voice on the other end was calm, refined, and unmistakably serious. Dr. Reyes, my name is Thomas Randall. I represent the Carnegie Medical Trust. We've been following your discovery closely. The trust would like to formally acquire the Holt collection for preservation. We're prepared to offer a substantial sum. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the dark window that reflected his face like a ghost. How substantial? He asked finally. Randall named the figure. It was more money than Daniel could have imagined earning in 10 lifetimes. Enough to buy security, peace, comfort, all the things he'd been denied since Eleanor's death. He thanked the man and said he would think about it. After he hung up, he remained sitting in the dim light for a long time, listening to the steady tick of Lily's small travel clock. When she came to say goodnight, she found him still at the desk, hands clasped tightly together. Was that about the hospital? She asked. He nodded. They want to buy what we found. All of it. Her brow furrowed in confusion. But it's not for sale, right? It belongs here. He looked at her, the innocence in her eyes cutting through him like sunlight through fog. I don't know, he said quietly. Maybe selling it would help us start fresh. We could live somewhere better. You could have a real school, real friends. She smiled a little. But then who would fix the hospital? Her words landed softly, but they stayed with him long after she fell asleep. That night, Daniel dreamed of Eleanor. She stood in a corridor bathed in light, the same hallway where he'd first seen the flickering bulb come to life weeks ago. She said nothing, only touched his arm and looked at him with a kind of sorrowful pride. When he woke, the decision had already been made. He called Randall back in the morning. I'm not selling, he said. The collection stays here. There was a long silence on the other end before the man replied, Dr. Reyes, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I know, Daniel said, but so was finding it. When the call ended, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew it would be right. He spent the rest of that day walking through the hospital, touching the walls, studying the spaces as though he could hear their hidden plans whispering back to him. Within weeks, more letters and emails arrived, from philanthropists, museums, universities. Some praised his integrity, others called him a fool, but among them came one message that caught his attention. It was from a woman named Margaret Hale, the director of the Holt Foundation for Medical Progress. Her message was brief. We would like to support your restoration efforts. Dr. Holt believed in community medicine. Let's honor that belief. Attached was a formal proposal for funding, complete with the foundation's seal and a personal donation pledge from several prominent benefactors. It was enough to start the work. Construction began that spring. The first crew arrived in April, their trucks kicking up dust on the winding road to the hill. The sound of hammers and saws soon filled the air, blending with birdsong. Scaffolding rose against the walls like ribs rebuilding themselves. Daniel watched it all unfold with cautious awe. Some of the townspeople who had once mocked him now volunteered their weekends to help repaint, to plant flowers, to repair the front gate. The same men who had laughed about the haunted hospital now called out greetings when he passed in town. He worked alongside them, day after day, his hands steady, his movements sure. The tremor that had once defined his life had vanished entirely. There were moments when he caught himself laughing, a sound that startled him with its unfamiliar warmth. In the evenings, when the workers left, he and Lily stayed behind to sweep the halls and hang curtains. She insisted on drawing new signs for every department: pediatrics, recovery, hope room. It became their shared language, brushstrokes and laughter echoing in a place once filled with silence. By midsummer, the East Wing was complete. Fresh paint gleamed on the walls, and the smell of disinfectant was replaced by the clean scent of pine from the newly sanded floors. Daniel stood at the entrance one evening, the sunset pouring through the windows, and felt tears prick his eyes. The building that had once represented his lowest point had become a living monument to renewal. News crews returned, filming the transformation. A journalist from a major network arrived, microphone in hand, asking how it felt to go from ruin to resurrection. Daniel hesitated before answering. "I didn't resurrect anything," he said. "The hospital was never dead. It was just waiting for someone to remember it mattered." The clip went viral within days. Donations followed. Letters arrived from across the country. Doctors, former patients, even strangers, all thanking him for reminding them why healing mattered beyond profit or prestige. Still, he remained humble. Each morning he began work before sunrise, walking the halls in quiet reflection. He found that he no longer dreaded the stillness. It was no longer the sound of grief. It was the breath of progress. One afternoon, as he checked the refurbished surgical ward, a local contractor approached him. "Doc," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow, "there's something you should see." He followed him to the old boiler room, where workers had unearthed a sealed metal capsule from beneath the floorboards. Inside was a rolled-up piece of parchment wrapped in oilcloth. When Daniel unwrapped it, his breath caught. It was a letter from Dr. Holt himself, dated December 1956. "If this hospital ever breathes again, let it be for those who cannot afford to breathe elsewhere. Science without compassion is decay. Medicine without mercy is vanity. Build not for fame, but for the human spirit." Daniel read the words aloud to the gathered crew. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, one of the older men said quietly, "Guess we're building more than walls then." From that day, something shifted. Volunteers poured in. Local students helped repaint murals. Retired nurses donated old equipment. The community that had once looked at Willow Hill with superstition now looked at it with pride. When the first floor was completed, Daniel held a small gathering in what used to be the main lobby. The chandelier that had once hung crooked now gleamed with restored crystal, scattering light across the marble. People filled the space. Townsfolk, donors, even the mayor. Lily stood beside him, holding his hand. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, looking out at the faces before him. "I came here because I'd lost everything," he began, "and I thought this building was another mistake, another thing falling apart. But what I learned is that broken things aren't useless. They just need someone willing to believe they can be whole again. This hospital was built to heal. Now it's healed me, and maybe it can heal others too." Applause filled the room, but Daniel barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on Lily, who was beaming, proud and teary all at once. Over the next months, the transformation accelerated. The North Wing became a small community clinic, offering free checkups to families who couldn't afford private care. The South Wing turned into a training space for medical students, complete with modern equipment donated by universities inspired by Holt's rediscovered work. The hospital's new sign, Eleanor Reyes Community Hospital, was unveiled in a quiet ceremony attended by the town, and a few of Daniel's old colleagues who had driven hours to see what he had built. When the sheet was pulled away, revealing the engraved name, Daniel's throat tightened. The letters shimmered faintly in the sunlight, a tribute to a woman who had believed healing was more than science. It was kindness. That evening, after everyone had gone, he wandered the halls alone. The lights glowed softly, reflecting off the polished floors. He stopped by the old research lab, now preserved as a historical exhibit, and looked at Dr. Holt's tools displayed behind glass. The hum of the building's new electrical system filled the silence. He realized with quiet awe that the same walls that had once held despair now carried hope like a current. In the months that followed, Daniel noticed a change not just in the hospital but in himself. His posture straightened, his laughter came easier, and when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the broken man he had been. He saw a doctor again, one reborn not through miracles, but through persistence, through faith, through the small, steady act of rebuilding. One autumn evening, he performed his first surgery in over 3 years. A simple procedure, a minor repair, but to him it felt monumental. His hands did not tremble. The rhythm of precision returned as if it had never left. When the patient stabilized, he stepped out of the operating room and stood for a long while in the quiet hallway, feeling the tears run freely down his cheeks. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines that lined the hill, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the workers still cleaning up after another day. The hospital glowed in the dusk, a lantern against the coming dark. Daniel whispered into the cool air, "We did it, Eleanor. We really did." And though no voice answered, he felt her presence there, in the hum of the lights, in the rhythm of the monitors, in the heartbeat of a place that had found its second breath. Winter passed gently that year, as though the snow itself had learned to fall quietly over the hill out of reverence. By spring, the hospital no longer looked like the relic it once was. The scaffolding was gone, the ivy trimmed, the walls painted a clean, hopeful white that caught the sunlight like polished stone. On the front lawn, new flowers bloomed where the ground had once been barren. The town that had laughed at Daniel Reyes now looked up toward Willow Hill with pride, telling newcomers, "That's our hospital, the one the doctor rebuilt." Every morning, Daniel still arrived before dawn, the same way he had when he was young and certain of his calling. He would walk through the entrance, past the bronze plaque engraved with Eleanor Reyes Community Hospital, and feel a flicker of gratitude so strong it sometimes took his breath away. He would pause for a moment, touch the cold metal letters with his fingertips, and whisper to the memory of his wife, "We're still here." The halls smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint, the kind of scent that meant life was happening again. Nurses greeted him as he passed. Volunteers waved from the reception desk, and in the daycare room, he could hear the faint laughter of children whose parents worked shifts or came for treatment. It was everything he had once dreamed of without ever realizing it was possible. Lily, now 10, had grown tall and confident. She had a small desk near the front entrance where she helped greet patients, proudly wearing a plastic badge that read, "Junior Volunteer." Her drawings still adorned the walls, bright suns, hearts, flowers, and smiling stick figures labeled hope and healing. Visitors often stopped to look at them, smiling at the childlike sincerity of her art. When Daniel passed her desk, she would grin and call out, "Morning, Dr. Reyes," and he would answer with a mock seriousness, "Morning, Miss Reyes. Keep up the good work." It had become their ritual. The hospital's success spread quickly beyond the town. Patients came from neighboring counties, drawn by stories of the rebuilt facility that treated everyone, regardless of what they could pay. The North Wing, once a derelict corridor of broken doors, now housed a fully functioning community clinic with volunteer physicians. The South Wing had become a training center for young doctors and nurses. Students came from universities across the state to study there, inspired by the hospital's story. In one of the rooms, a small museum displayed Dr. Matthew Holt's rediscovered instruments and notes preserved behind glass. Visitors wandered through it in silence, reading the words he had written decades ago. "Build not for fame, but for the human spirit." Daniel often found himself standing in front of that display when the corridors grew quiet. He would look at Holt's delicate handwriting, at the crude devices that had once been revolutionary, and feel an unspoken kinship with the man who had worked here before him. Both had known loss, both had hidden their hearts in their work, and both had trusted time to carry their purpose forward. By summer, the hospital was alive with noise and color. The cafeteria had been transformed into a communal kitchen where townspeople cooked and shared meals. The courtyard bustled with children playing under the care of nurses between shifts. In one corner stood a small statue of Eleanor, sculpted from photographs and memories, her expression serene and wise. Beneath it, carved into stone, was her favorite saying, "Light cures more than medicine ever will." Daniel's days were long but full. He consulted patients, mentored young doctors, and coordinated the ever-growing list of programs. Yet the work never felt like a burden. There was a rhythm to it, the kind that came when duty and purpose moved in harmony. Sometimes as he walked through the halls, he would hear laughter echoing from rooms that had once held only dust, and he would stop to listen, remembering the first day he and Lily had stepped into this building when it was silent and dead. The contrast was almost unbelievable. Late one afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to him personally. The envelope bore the seal of the Holt Foundation. Inside was a short message from Margaret Hale. "The board has approved funding for the expansion project. The new medical clinic on Willow Hill will serve as a regional center for free treatment. Construction can begin this fall. Thank you for reminding us that compassion is still medicine's greatest science." At the bottom, there was a personal note in her own handwriting. "You've given this place a soul, Dr. Reyes. Few can say they've done that." When Daniel finished reading, he set the letter down and looked out his office window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn where volunteers were planting more flowers. He could see Lily kneeling beside an elderly woman, laughing as they worked side by side. The sight filled him with a quiet, humbling joy. For so long he had lived haunted by failure, the operation he couldn't save, the career he thought he'd lost, the life that had fallen apart. But all along, perhaps he had been guided here, to this forgotten hill, to rebuild not what was lost, but what was meant to be found. That evening, as he prepared to lock up, he walked the halls one last time. He passed the pediatric ward, where a nurse read bedtime stories to children. He passed the small chapel, where candles flickered softly beside photos of loved ones. In the far wing, he paused by a door that led to what had once been Dr. Holt's laboratory. Now it served as a small memorial room filled with framed letters and photographs of families who had written to thank the hospital for changing their lives. Daniel stood before one of the newest additions, a picture of a young boy smiling beside a heart monitor. The note beneath it read, "He's alive because you gave us hope." He stayed there for a while, letting the stillness settle over him. When he finally turned to leave, he found Lily waiting in the hallway, her hands behind her back. "You're supposed to be in bed," he said gently. "I wanted to say goodnight here," she replied. She stepped forward and handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing of the hospital, now glowing, surrounded by stars, with the words, "The Hospital of Hope," written across the top. At the bottom she had drawn herself and her father, standing beneath the sign, both smiling. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Lily tilted her head. "Do you miss Mom tonight?" He nodded. "Every night." "Me too," she said, and slipped her hand into his. "But I think she's happy. You fixed her hospital." He looked down at her, surprised. "Her hospital?" "She's the reason you built it," Lily said simply. "You said she believed in helping people. So now we do too." For a long time he couldn't speak. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "You're right." The following week, the hospital celebrated its second anniversary since reopening. Reporters came again, but this time Daniel didn't mind. They weren't here for him. They were here for the story of what humanity could still be. Cameras flashed, people clapped, and the mayor gave a speech about how one man's courage had revived a dying town. When Daniel was asked to speak, he stepped to the microphone and looked out over the crowd. The faces before him were no longer strangers. They were neighbors, friends, people he had come to love. "I didn't rebuild this place alone," he began. "This hospital belongs to everyone who refused to give up on it. and on themselves. It belongs to the hands that painted these walls, to the people who walked through these doors looking for help and found hope instead. And it belongs to a woman who taught me that light doesn't come from what we do, but from why we do it. He paused, glancing toward the statue of Eleanor standing in the courtyard. We built these walls with faith, not concrete. And as long as someone walks through these doors believing that kindness can heal, this hospital will never die again. The applause that followed seemed endless, but Daniel barely heard it. His eyes had filled with tears, and all he could see was the shimmer of sunlight reflecting off the windows. The same windows that once stared down over emptiness. Now they reflected life. In the months that followed, the hospital continued to grow. New wards opened, more doctors joined, and the Foundation's expansion project broke ground on the neighboring field. The local news reported that Willow Hill had become one of the region's most successful examples of community medicine. But for Daniel, the real success was quieter. It was in the way the nurses laughed during morning rounds, in the way the children waved at him when he passed, in the letters of thanks that filled his office drawers. Sometimes, late at night, when the world outside was still, he would wander to the rooftop terrace. From there, the entire valley spread out before him, the town lights twinkling below, the hills bathed in moonlight. On clear nights, he could see the reflection of the hospital's new sign glowing faintly. Eleanor Reyes Community Hospital, built on love, reborn in hope. He often thought about the path that had brought him here, about the trembling hands that once couldn't hold a scalpel, the despair that had nearly consumed him. He thought of the laughter of the townspeople who had mocked him, the rusted doors, the cold nights filled with doubt. Every pain, every failure had led him to this. The realization was so profound that sometimes he would close his eyes and whisper into the wind, "Thank you." On one such night, Lily found him there. She had brought 2 mugs of cocoa and handed him one. Together they watched the lights of the valley below. "Do you ever think about the first night we came here?" she asked. "All the time," he said. "I remember thinking this place was nothing but ruins. And now," he smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. "Now I think it's where everything began." Lily leaned her head against his arm. "I want to be a doctor one day," she said sleepily. "Like you." Daniel looked down at her, his heart full. "You already are, sweetheart. You heal me every day." She laughed softly, half asleep, and he kissed her hair, his eyes drifting once more to the hospital that glowed like a beacon in the darkness. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Somewhere in the night, an ambulance siren rose and fell, not a sound of fear, but of purpose. The hospital on Willow Hill stood tall against the sky, its lights warm and steady. It no longer hid secrets or shadows. It had become what all true sanctuaries are, not a monument of stone, but of spirit. And in that spirit lived the memory of a woman, the love of a child, and the heart of a man who had once been broken and found his way home again. Long after he and Lily went back inside, the hill remained bright, the windows shining into the night like open eyes watching over the valley, a promise that hope, once found, would never be lost again. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. There are more real-life miracles waiting for you. Watch the next video now and share this one with someone who still believes that hope can rebuild anything.